The other day, I got a call from my oldest son. He said he needed to talk about a problem he was having. He has been married just under 3 years and is afraid his wife is fooling around. Since I have experience with this kind of thing, he is confident that I can help him. I think I can. Honestly, I haven't thought about it in a long time, but he is my son and his mother, and I have had our own issues. It wasn't that long ago. In fact, I had to go back to the 1990s to come to any conclusion. I'm proud of my boy. I'm proud of all my children. If he needs fatherly advice, I'll try to share what I have. I think I'll just sit down and try to go back and refresh my memory. Maybe I'll jot down some notes. I want to be ready when it comes. We'll see. Part 1. First Love. I met the woman I considered my one true love back in high school when I was in 10th grade. Her name was Carol Manning, and believe me, she was just the cat's meow. Long blonde hair, not very large, but well-built body and brilliant blue eyes. She was one of the most popular girls in our class. We were the same age. Every guy ran after her. And me? My name was Brad Wernicke. I was skinny, a little tall, and probably a gangster. She wasn't interested in me at all. I couldn't blame her. I was shy, socially inferior, not particularly athletic, not particularly artistic or musical. I first saw her at her 16th birthday party. Her boyfriend at the time was 2 years older, a real jerk named Vernon Smithers. Everyone knew him. He worked with cars all the time, so his fingernails were always in putty. Lifted heavy weights until his head was too small for his torso. Had greasy black hair, and spent most of his free time on the corner, snapping and snapping at the younger kids. He always had the same catchphrase. If anyone dared look in his direction, he would scowl and say, "What are you looking at?" He only had two things, a part-time job and a car. I hated him. So she was at her party. I swear she looked like a goddess. She saw me. I was at the other end of the room. I wasn't even invited. I came with another guy who knew her. She didn't know me from Adam, but she looked right at me, smiled, and slipped through the crowd, stood right in front of me, then leaned forward and kissed me. Then, without saying a word, she made an 80 turn and walked back to her boyfriend. I saw him. If he had a gun, I'd be dead. Oh yes, I had an enemy, but I didn't care. I was desperately and hopelessly in love. She must have known it too because she tilted her head slightly and looked at me before turning back to her boyfriend. She must have said something about me because he looked in my direction and gave me one of those predatory, "I'm so much better than you" smiles. Carol reminded me of that girl in the movie Footloose. She may not have been in bed yet, but she sure had been kissed a lot. She was way out of my league. I remembered Mrs. Warheim, my English teacher. She was a Dickens fan. It was as if Carol was Estella and I was Pip. She was the unapproachable beauty and I was the dirty boy. It didn't matter. I didn't care. I had to have her. I was willing to do anything, but I had to make her mine. So one by one, guy by guy, I gradually managed to beat all my competitors. By the time we got to prom, it was just her and me. Yeah, and it helped that her parents made her stop dating Vernon. Graduation came. We got our diplomas and headed to the beach. We were old enough to finish what we started together. Talk about the glory days. September came, and I started applying to college. I wanted to be a school teacher, a math teacher. Carol wanted to be a nurse. I went to community college and she got a room in one of the dorms at one of the large hospitals downtown. Over the next 4 years, we had our ups and downs. Besides classes, I had to work, and Carol lived 20 miles away, so we didn't see each other very often. I think I also got a few doses of maturity from my home life. For example, one day my father collapsed at work, a massive brain hemorrhage. He was kept in the emergency room with ice for several days. They had to open him up and remove some of the brain tissue. It left a dent in his head. The company he worked for gave him a small severance package and then let him go, leaving us all to fend for ourselves. Dad became crippled and spent the rest of his life sitting in a chair. Sometimes Mom would have to help him eat. He would get angry and shout a bunch of barely intelligible swear words or just sit there with tears streaming down his cheeks. He could have sued, but he wasn't litigious. Besides, he was proud, so he never sought any kind of government assistance. My mom had to go out to work, and I had to help my siblings. I had and still have a younger brother and a younger sister. Without my dad's strong hand, my younger brother Todd was going through a difficult time. He was skipping school and his grades went down the toilet. One day, my mom had to go to the police station to get him out of there. The younger sister, her name was Susan, was a real heartache for several years. I think she was a lot like Carol. Susan was too pretty and too popular too soon, and that attracted the wrong guys to her. Mom and I had a very hard time keeping her afloat. A couple times I had to secretly follow her in the car to steer her away from one guy who was too old for her. Todd and I caught up with him one night, had a long talk, and the guy agreed to stay away. And that was a good thing, because Todd loved to fight. Poor Dad just watched helplessly. It was pathetic. Dad was such a strong man, a real role model. He held us all together. I tried my best, but I was never like him. It was Mom who broke my heart. Dad was already sitting in his chair, and Mom still had her own thing going on. There was a small tavern a couple blocks from our house, and Mom started sneaking in there every once in a while to get laid. Sometimes she would get home late from work and tell us it was because of mandatory overtime. Other times, she would come home at the usual time, clean herself up, put on something nice, slip out the back door, and disappear for 2 or 3 hours. My father knew, but never said anything. He was a proud man, and I knew what she did hurt him. I think in the end, it helped him die. My father died when I was still in college. His death affected my mom in the most profound way. Even though he was crippled, and even though she did horrible things, she truly loved him. After he died, she cried all the time, did nothing but work, stopped eating, lost interest in everything, and just hung around the house. I think the guilt and loss almost killed her. It's true. You don't know what you have until you lose it. Back to Carol and me. We broke up a few times, but after what was usually a short break, we managed to get things back on track. I didn't pay much attention to it at the time, but now, looking back, I realized that our separations were probably times when she thought she had found someone else to play with. I never did anything like that. She was all I ever wanted. But I had my suspicions about her. I mean, I cared. I was just lying, and it bothered me. I was being faithful. I wanted her to stay faithful, but we weren't married. We didn't get engaged until the spring of senior year, and I couldn't prove anything anyway. About proof, I think I went a little overboard once. I didn't own her. I couldn't force her to be faithful, but one day during my junior year, my suspicions took over. We were long distance, and I was sure she was up to something. I kept calling, trying to talk to her, trying to make up, but all my calls were intercepted by her friends from nursing school. They yelled at me and lectured me about how unfair I was being, and that even though Carol really loved me, she needed some time apart once in a while. They told me she was there in the dorm, but she was so sad and miserable. All she did was cry and confess to them how rude I was to her. I was never rude to her. I was serious. I was always a little insecure when it came to Carol. It's hard to be a mortal in love with a goddess. I started going into town to see what was going on, if anything at all. But I couldn't find anything. Carol had a car, but she kept it in one of those big private garages. The only way to find out that her car was gone was to park it and walk through all the levels. The only thing I could do was get in the car near the hospital or drive around to see if I could catch it. The only thing I was capable of doing was driving myself crazy. But I loved her so much. It was awful. My dad would sit in a chair at home and watch my mom go in and out, and I would drive around and know nothing. Sometimes I wondered who had it worse. I think it was my dad. Eventually, I graduated from high school and got a job as a math teacher, and Carol got a job at a pediatric clinic near where we grew up. We got married, had a beautiful wedding, and finally hit the road. A few months passed and Carol became pregnant. Our first child was a boy, and we named him after me. A couple years after that, a girl was born. We named her Bridget after Carol's mom. When the family became 2 children, Carol decided that instead of having her tubes tied, she would take the pill. I, not wanting to be impregnated, agreed. It didn't occur to me then that her decision not to get her tubes tied could someday lead to trouble. Life went on, and that was a good thing. We bought a small starter home in a quiet old neighborhood. Since we had her mom, Carol never took time off work because of pregnancy or childcare. Carol stayed at the clinic and took over while I got several promotions, eventually becoming principal and moving to a new, large middle school. Throughout this time, we were always close. I mean, no long meetings or workshops out of state. Every once in a while, I would be recalled for a few days, and once or twice, Carol would get the opportunity to supplement her education by spending the night at one of the major hospitals in town. What I meant by that was, I was there and she was there. So there were no old excuses like you're never around, or we hardly ever see each other. It was just the same annoyance. As Junior moved into sixth grade, I started to realize something was wrong. I could have sworn that our normal interactions hadn't changed much, but I was sure something wasn't as it should be. What was it that made me raise my eyebrows? I think it was the little things, the things I saw in my mom. It was the other things that bothered me. We always talked. We talked about kids and vacations and our long-term plans. Kids, vacations, bills, household needs were still on the table. But we stopped talking about long-term plans. That is, Carol still looked a few days and weeks ahead, but anything a year or two ahead stopped taking up time. It may sound silly, but we had our share of camping trips. We went from tent to cot and explored trailers for a while. Carol talked about saving vacation and work time for a long drive across the country. She seemed excited for a while, but then it stopped. I was still talking about things like the Grand Canyon and Monument Valley, but she stopped participating. I'd mention something, ask her a couple questions, and she'd sort of stammer and dodge the answer. She'd nod nervously, agree, and then answer something like, "Yeah, but the thing is," or "Sure, yeah, but it's not a good time." When she talked like that, I noticed that she never looked at me. She wasn't looking ahead like I was. Perhaps she had other plans. This was before the widespread availability of affordable cell phones, GPS units, and laptops, and the internet was in its infancy, so modern concepts of electronic surveillance were still just looming on the horizon, at least in my imagination. Nor were private investigators. First of all, the idea of spying on my wife was unacceptable to me. And secondly, Carol handled the money. Doesn't that bother you? It should. Carol handled the money. We had a checking account, but I never used it. We had one credit card that we both used, and besides, we still did most things in cash. I used the card for gas and trips to the lumber mill, but paid for groceries and other items with green paper. Carol did the shopping, bought the kids' clothes, and paid the bills. From time to time, I would ask, "Are we all right?" And Carol always answered, "We're doing fine." It wasn't the money, not at first, that was the real red flag. I was the school principal, and that meant things like PTA and sports. Fall meant soccer on Fridays, soccer and hockey after school. Winter meant basketball and volleyball, and spring meant baseball, lacrosse, and track and field. Of course, I couldn't make it to every game, but I was expected to attend most of them, and that left Carol home alone with the kids from time to time. I had to rethink that a bit. There were a few occasions when I had to be absent, and so did Carol. For me, there was the Middle States Commission on Secondary Schools, as well as the Southern Regional Board of Education. These two organizations were empowered to set up temporary committees that periodically visited the participating high schools. As a high school principal, I was required to participate periodically as a specialist, sometimes in administration, sometimes in math, in visiting the various schools. These visits could take as much as a week away from home. Carol, being a supervisor, also had to be away from home from time to time. I never believed that anything would come out of these trips. Perhaps I was wrong. I'll never know. Nevertheless, Carol stayed home alone with the kids, or did she? 2 houses down lived Jenny McFertle, 16 years old, mature, and ready to work as a nanny. I suspect something started in the fall when the youngest was in 6th grade. Bridget was in 4th grade, and I had Friday night soccer. Carol was good at her job, but not smart. She had coworkers, and I had soccer. It was too easy. I could stay late at school and stay for the game, or I could come home, get a snack, change, and leave. Sometimes, weather permitting, I would even take my kids with me. Believe me, if I took my kids to a soccer game, it was very beneficial to them. They could socialize with the older kids, and there were always a bunch of junior high or high school girls ready to butter up the principal and play babysitter. Either way, Jenny McFertle or high school girls, it was good for me, good for our kids, and good for Carol. Only different for her. I didn't want to prolong the conversation with my son, so I decided to lay it out as clearly as possible. I remember learning that there were two kinds of romances. One was the sneaky trivia type, and the other was the little-known romance on the road. And the trick of it all was that a dirty little tryst could escalate into something worse. Here's what was really unpleasant. I was essentially a school teacher, and Carol worked among doctors, and that mattered. Doctors, for the most part, are wonderful people. They help people. Teachers too, but doctors save lives. There's clearly something to complicate things here. Both teachers and doctors are pretty well educated, but doctors, as I said, deal with life and death, or at least sometimes with serious medical problems, and are always looked upon with a great deal of deference. Teachers get some respect too, but not as much as doctors. This difference can be devastating, especially when it comes to someone's family. To digress a bit, my father worked in a warehouse and Carol's father was a plumber. In short, we both came from working-class backgrounds. In our families, doctors were highly respected, very highly respected. As a professional, I worked with children. Carol's colleagues were doctors. I was dazzled by the purity of innocent young minds. Carol was blinded by smug, godlike beings in white who were rarely, if ever, wrong. Unfortunately for me and my family, one of these dazzling creatures turned out to be a doctor who specialized in treating childhood cancer. Of course, no math teacher turned school principal, regardless of the complexity of the quadratic equation, could match the surgeon who saved the lives of little boys and girls suffering from diseases like leukemia. I never thought of Carol as calculating. I think I was wrong. Moreover, I was decidedly and undeniably wrong. One day at one of Carol's professional events, I met Dr. Maynard Gilmore. I liked him. He seemed to me an affable and trustworthy man. He was unmarried, as I found out later, divorced. But that didn't mean anything at the time. After a dozen years of marriage and 2 children, I trusted my wife. I had faith in her. I was a fool. Not that I seriously suspected any infidelity, emotional or otherwise. I didn't look around for any signs. There were. I noticed, but I honestly didn't suspect anything. It was Carol's stupidity, or rather her carelessness, that turned everything around. So every Friday night, with or without the kids, I went to soccer. Then winter came, and it was time for basketball. Carol was good, but something was going wrong. She made it through the soccer season without giving anything away, but basketball games rarely fell on a Friday. There were times on a Friday or two, but more often than not, they were late games played on Thursdays. From some point on, I guess that Carol didn't stick to any kind of reliable schedule. Carol used to stick to Fridays, but now often went out on other nights as well. I was often home when she came in from short dates with coworkers. My recollection now is that there was a kid there, a middle school student who needed to retake a health class, and his retake was scheduled for 2 days a week, Mondays and Wednesdays. Normally, health classes were 3 days long. The boy decided that he could skip Monday and the teacher would decide that he only needed 1 hour. The kid started skipping Mondays. Then he got careless and started coming in on Mondays and skipping Wednesdays. The teacher suspected something wrong, checked his records for September, and the kid got reprimanded for it. He paid with detention and 3 days of health for the rest of the year. Believe me, the night it finally all came out on her, it wasn't the smell of alcohol on her breath, it wasn't the indifference to our long-term plans, it wasn't the blind rush to get past the kids and me when she got home from a night out with friends. It was her outfit. Carol was always something of a clothes horse. She always had to have the latest styles, the prettiest blouses, the prettiest dresses. Her hair always had to be put up in a special style. Her nails painted, and her makeup had to be special. So why did she come home that night looking so campy? Why was her makeup so sloppy? Why was her hair so disheveled? And what were those stains on her skirt and blouse? The first time or two, I didn't pay attention. To be honest, at first I didn't notice or pretended not to notice, but pretty soon I had the right signals. Finally, I asked her, "Carol, what happens to you on those nights when you come home late?" She looked at me kind of dumbfounded. I realized she was drunk. She asked, "What do you mean?" I said, "Look at yourself. What have you been doing? Where have you been? You look like you've been in a mud wrestling contest." She replied, "Just out with friends." Annoyed, impatient, I asked, "Really? With who?" She told me. She mentioned several names, including a couple of doctors, one of whom was Maynard Gilmore. I asked, "I'm sorry, Carol, but you don't look well. What's wrong?" As I said, she was quite drunk, not falling over, but definitely not herself. Everyone knows that alcohol affects a person's self-control. They become more relaxed, less restrained. She wasn't herself. She was standing there in our living room. The kids had already gone to bed, and she said, "For heaven's sake, Brad, you know. I know you know." I replied, "No, Carol, I don't know." And frankly, I didn't know. And then she dropped the bomb. "Me and Dr. Gilmore. You know?" And that's when I realized everything. I felt like someone had just walked over my grave. I needed to hear more. "No, Carol. What do you mean you and Dr. Gilmore?" Then she started crying. She sat up and said, "I'm sorry, Brad." My first reaction was, that can't be true. But it was. Like Dickens, there had been better times an hour before, but not now. She sobbed a few times, then said, "Dr. Gilmore and me. Well, us. Brad, I'm so sorry. We love each other." My world had just come to an end. I was trapped in the lunette. The blade was coming down. My head was falling into the basket. It's funny what thoughts rush through a person's brain at such moments. I remembered reading once that after decapitation, a person retains a semblance of consciousness for up to 7 seconds. Come to think of it, that was my 7 seconds. Imagine 7 seconds from life to something else. I had no idea what I was supposed to say or do. Something just sort of washed over me. It was like a powerful electric current, a short, overwhelming surge, and then I died. I knew. I just knew. This, what had been us, we, was over. I said, "You're leaving me." I said it. Just like that, I said it, and I knew it was true. No preparation, no preparation, no preparation, no preparation, no preparation, no secret, nothing. One minute I was married, I had a wife, I had a family and a home, and the next minute, nothing, an abyss. Looking back, I realize it was much worse than that. That night I was in a complete state of distress. I remember not crying, not begging, not pleading, not asking. But I remember how I felt, and it was bad, horrible, but not as bad as it could have been. Carol was sitting there, hair a mess, blouse wrinkled, mouth smelling awful, and she said, "Yes, Brad, I guess it is." I remembered that she was trying to portray a "let's sympathize" attitude. I've seen teachers play the same game with kids year after year. To me, it was old hat. She sat for a while, recovered a bit, but it was obvious she was still stoned. She said, "Brad, I love you. I've always loved you. I'm just not in love with you anymore." That struck me. What an old joke. Me, our marriage. It had become a cliché. I went from stunned to completely annoyed. No, it wasn't anger, it was rage. It was blind rage. It was time to strike back. I looked around the room and the first thing I saw was her locker. Well, it needed to be cleaned. Standing up and heading for her precious collection of heirlooms, I yelled, "You goddamn bitch!" I got to the closet a little before she did. She knew what I was up to. She was only 1 microsecond late. I grabbed one of the side flaps and yanked as hard as I could. It was a fragile antique, an heirloom. The damned door fell off. My hands found themselves inside, grabbing for her precious moments. Waterford candlesticks, a Swarovski vase, my grandmother's old trinkets. All of them scattered everywhere. I broke everything I could reach, and I did it with malice, with deep anger. Carol screamed and cried, begging me to stop, but I was just getting started. It only took a few seconds to destroy the wild card. Then I moved on to the TV, the stereo, and the paintings. I smashed everything. I grabbed the wall cabinet in the dining room, the good china, the husband and wife dolls under a plastic dome, the special gifts, the crystal wine glasses. I stormed into the house. She followed me in. I pushed her away and ruined everything. On the wall, I saw a picture. Everyone has a picture like that, a happy bride and groom in wedding attire. It was in my lap. I ripped the picture out and tore it to shreds. I scattered it like it was confetti. I shouted, "Yay, it's over!" And then I went to the kitchen, to the damn knickknacks she had scattered all over the damn kitchen, her little baby things. I wasn't angry anymore. I didn't feel anything. I didn't care. Everything had to go. I picked up one kitchen chair after another and smashed them against everything I could reach. I reached down to the floor, pulled out the everyday china, and started tossing it in all directions. I broke off the gooseneck faucet. She followed me, crying and begging. She didn't understand. Every little thing, every piece of furniture, every plate, every glass, did they belong to her? I opened the refrigerator and everything inside was soon outside. Milk, iced tea, leftover chicken, half a portion. Everything was everywhere. I was going crazy. Then it all stopped. In the gap between the kitchen and the dining room stood my two children. They looked scared. Bridget said something. I think she said daddy. I collapsed onto the last unbroken kitchen chair and began to sob, howl, like a small child. Carol put the kids to bed and went back into the kitchen. I was still crying, but not her. No, Carol wasn't crying. Carol was in full slut mode. She stood across from me and said coldly, "You have to leave. Pack your suitcase and just leave." I looked at her, then at the house and the ruins. She was right. I knew that if I stayed there one more minute, my children would be motherless and I would end up in jail. I went upstairs and packed my overnight bag. It surprised me how much control I had. All the disbelief, the denial, the tragedy just disappeared. I just needed to get away. I moved, first to a motel room, then to a small apartment near our house. Of course, I was sad, I was desperately unhappy, but I was a man. I could handle it. My father put up with a lot more. I could do it because I was my father's son. When I thought about telling all this to my son, because almost 20 years separated that night from the present, I wondered even now how I could have been so calm in the days that followed. My son told me how scared he and Bridget had been that night. He said Bridget cried for days, but I already knew all that. Carol didn't wait or delay. Her great confession came Thursday night. She got a restraining order. She got a lawyer, and a vicious one at that. I got it served the following Friday. At least she didn't try to make me work. I wondered how to explain the next few nightmarish weeks to my son. I hired a lawyer. Carol had her own, and we all met at her attorney's office. Although the animosity at that meeting was toxic, we still managed to work out a pretty fair agreement. First, about the feud. I still wanted to know the reason, but she had no answer. She said she had fallen out of love with me and needed to move on. I asked her why she didn't come to me. I said that maybe if she had come, we could have worked something out. I said that she was the only woman in my life, and I couldn't imagine myself with another. And then she understood me. It hit me right between the eyes. I don't remember her exact words, but their impact echoed in my soul for years to come. She told me that I was no longer fulfilling her needs. She had outgrown me. She told me that I was boring, that life with me had become tedious, that I was a pathetic nothing that was going nowhere. She said she needed filet mignon and I needed a hamburger. She really resented me. She told me she couldn't believe I was still a virgin when we met on the beach. She said her boyfriend, Vernon Smithers, had already done it with her, and even later when we were dating. Oh my God, Vernon Smithers. She told me she was only dating me because her parents made her break up with Vernon. She said she kind of liked me, but never really loved me. That I was just someone her parents thought was suitable. She said she was comfortable with me, but never passionate, not for her. It was painful, very painful. It was like Carol was reading my mind. She just sat there and smirked. Carol said she couldn't believe that the whole time we were in high school, me in college and her in nursing school, I wasn't doing anything. I told her that wasn't true. She told me that throughout nursing school she had 4 or 5 boyfriends a year. I said I didn't believe her, but she really got me. She started naming men, dates, and places. They all roughly coincided with periods of our brief spats. She told me I was a fool all the way through. Admittedly, I was utterly crushed, but as I watched her story, I could see that she was enjoying every minute of it. I figured the revelation of the kind of person she was far worse for me than the breakup and divorce itself. Yet I sensed that something else was going on with Carol that day in the lawyer's office. Everything she said was too formulaic, as if rehearsed. Everything she said was probably true, but I remember thinking even as she was ranting that this could all be payback for the house and the curio. But it could be more than that. She caught her breath a couple times, and in between she said, "You need someone better. You need someone you can count on." Yes, I remember thinking it wasn't just anger at the house, but guilt. and not just guilt over her affair with the doctor. I was just too upset at the time to realize it. Carol had her own demons. But if you think about it, all those years, everything we'd done, the years of saving, the conversations, the dreams I thought we shared, none of it meant anything to her. I was an in-between, a thing to be used. Going into this meeting, I thought I hated her. By the time she was done, I realized it. I looked across the table at her and felt nothing. She was dead to me. I think she saw it in my eyes. Settlement. I was pleasantly surprised by the court's decision, at least at first. Carol wanted the house and she got it. We had just refinanced our mortgage. We put more money down and the interest and payments were quite low. Carol grinned crookedly. The house was exactly as she had planned it before the acknowledgement. She had planned it that way. Carol always managed the money. It never occurred to me to find out or confirm how much she made. How surprised I was. She actually made a little less than me. We divided our savings equally, but what did it matter? Most of it had already gone into the house. She was generous with child support and didn't demand it. Of course, there was a price to pay for that. I could stalk her and Gilmore at work. Interesting premise. I could have taken away their jobs. Gilmore would have suffered a minor injury, but his skills were such that he would have recovered quickly. Carol, on the other hand, would have burned out. But if she had burned out, I would have burned out too. I decided to let her keep her job. Let her keep her new lover. I just wanted out. She was good with the kids. With them, she could hurt me. With my destruction of the house and the fact that I pushed her, she had everything she needed to destroy me. She had proof. I knew it. She had mailed me pictures of what I had done. Yes, when it came to the kids, there was a piece of the old Carol left in them, the Carol I loved. I got every other weekend and one school night a week. She promised not to put up any obstacles. I supposed it wouldn't be easy at first because I'd need a decent place to live, but I figured I'd deal with that too, in time. There was one more obstacle, and it was a big one. I'd practically trashed the house. Carol demanded reimbursement for all her personal losses. I agreed, and the amount was substantial. I agreed to this because the physical damage was my fault. Finally, she agreed to split the legal fees. With the exception of personal property and our cars, all other property, whatever it was divided equally. Our denouement. I remembered reaching across the table to Carol at the end of the meeting. She jerked her hands away. I said, "I want to thank you." She looked embarrassed. She recoiled even more. She looked at me bewildered, as if she had forgotten something, as if there was an asset somewhere that she had missed. She asked, "For what?" Then I said, "Carol, maybe our marriage was a sham, and maybe everything I thought we'd built is just ashes in the wind. But I still want to thank you." She looked surprised. I continued, "I want to thank you for the 20 happiest years of my life. I want to thank you for all the dreams I thought we once shared. I want to thank you for our 2 wonderful children." I stopped and took a sip of water. I wasn't thinking about the children or the fact that they would always connect us. No, I was thinking about the fact that this might be the last time I see her. I concluded, "I know it's over between us. Our life together is dead, but I still have the memories. Carol, I will always remember you. I loved you once, and I will always remember you as that beautiful girl who once made all my dreams come true." She started to cry. I had to get up and walk away. I walked away a broken man. My wife, the woman I loved with all my heart, turned out to be nothing like the perfect person I had envisioned. All my illusions were shattered. And then it got worse. I could see the kids. And she stayed away. But she started poisoning the kids. I was being stupid, out of control, tearing the house apart, so she was always there. Carol started turning everything good we ever did into bad. She fed them half-truths and often outright lies. They were little, only 11 and 9 years old, and it was easy for them to believe what she said. It didn't take long, and soon they began to find reasons not to see me. It didn't make sense. Carol was still angry, and I couldn't understand why. She'd gotten everything she wanted. I had lost not only my wife and family, but my children as well. Then the small mercies began to appear. First, I needed a decent place to live. I didn't have the money to buy anything, but my mom supported me all the way. What did I know? Mom and Dad had been saving money all their lives. Mom talked to my brother and sister and convinced them to understand and even help a little. The three of them put together a small down payment, and I was able to buy an apartment on the second floor. It had 3 bedrooms, one full bathroom with a whirlpool tub, and a second bathroom with a toilet and sink. The apartment was part of a large complex that included a gym and a large outdoor pool. No, it wasn't a real house, but it was very close. My kids could find a way not to see me, but when they did, it wasn't in a cheap, dilapidated apartment. Then came Small Mercy number 2, and it was inadvertently provided by Carol. Just a few months after our divorce, she married Dr. Gilmore. Is that good news? Yes, good news for me and the kids. Suddenly, good old mommy had a new life. She became too busy to take care of her children. My kids began to see a different side of mommy that none of us had realized was there. But they also began to see a few new possibilities. They could have regular visits from Jenny McFertle and soon other babysitters, while Carol and her new man settled into their new home, or they could spend more time with their nasty daddy. They'd take their dad with them, visit his pool, gym, and of course go to daddy's school regularly. The kids were young but not stupid. Carol hurt them with her indifference. I saw that pain. I was ready to wipe away their tears. And then Carol gave me an even better, no, the best blessing of all. She got pregnant. I finally realized why she had avoided getting her tubes tied. All this time she had been looking forward, striving for new accomplishments. Did I believe that? I wasn't sure. But Dr. Gilmore wanted children of his own, and Carol was only too happy to help. So, 2 years after our divorce, I started seeing the kids more often than Carol did, and since they had bought a new house, the kids needed a change of schools. Guess what? Yeah, we switched the kids around. Carol alternated weekends with 1 day a week. The rest of the time, I had the kids. My life was changing, and for the better. But there were other things that weren't so good. One of them was work. For a long time, I was fine. Really fine. No one realized what was going on. Sure, on the rare occasions when Carol showed up, they noticed her absence, but no one, well, almost no one, knew the truth. Of course, that didn't help. I became a ghost at work. The truth about my failed marriage leaked out. What did I expect? My kids were with me at all the games. The students at my school were curious. Yes, Mr. Wernicke's wife left him for some doctor. It became like a Robert Louis Stevenson novel. Dr. Jekyll disappeared and Mr. Hyde moved into the house, and with that came a corresponding loss of respect. Of course, another bad thing, a very bad thing, was my self-esteem problem. Not only had Carol broken my heart, but she had successfully lied to me, hiding her true self from me for nearly 20 years. I wondered if that was really the case. It was hard to accept, and yet I guessed it was true, or I was too blind, or just too stupid. I had to get even, make amends for my stupidity. I wasn't going to get revenge on Carol, that ship had sailed, but I had to prove something. Was I a man? A real man? There was only one thing to do, and for the first 6 months or so I did just that. I went to every tavern, every bar, and every night spot in the neighborhood. I found women, met them, entertained them, and dumped them. I hit on every woman I saw. I made a fool of myself. I had a lot of girlfriends. I didn't fall in love with anything, but that didn't mean anything. The more I got, the more miserable I became. Of course, I frequented many of the night spots that Carol's friends frequented. I never planned it, it just happened. By then I had redone my entire closet and bought a new car. I was constantly going to the gym or pool. I got fit and gained muscle mass. Sooner or later it was bound to happen. Several of Carol's nurse friends saw me with a blonde. They saw me doing something I rarely did with Carol, dancing and having fun. Rumors reached Carol. She didn't call, and I didn't see her when I left the house or anything like that. Carol was furious. I wondered why she was furious. Why did she even bring this up with the kids? What was her problem? Hadn't she won? Hadn't she gotten what she wanted? These were just more questions that had no answers. Part 2. Salvation comes with red hair and freckles. Even I must have been killing myself, and I know it manifested at work. How do I know it manifested at work? I knew because another woman revealed it to me. I have to admit, I always noticed Miss Fitzgerald. She had the look. 5 feet tall, dark reddish-brown hair, freckles, skin like buttermilk, green eyes, and she acted like the classic Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz. She definitely looked different than Carol. And I mean, almost everyone liked her, including me, including the kids at school. Well, the kids didn't just like her, they adored her. They were crazy about her. But not everyone liked her. She had her detractors, too. Sometimes I wondered if some teacher's dislike of her was due to jealousy. A silly thought. Of course it was. I left her alone. She taught history. In my opinion, one of the most boring subjects in the school program, but she made it interesting. She ran the school store. And after school, she ran a music program where she taught banjo playing to the worst slackers in the school. I remember my first interaction with Miss Fitzgerald after my divorce. I was sitting at my desk in my office with the door open. I used to do that a lot. People were usually afraid of me, not in the sense that I might hit them, but because I was the principal and I could disrupt schedules and things like that, which I really never did. So Carol left me, and I guess I became something of a pathetic tough guy at work. But I had an excuse. I was in pain. I was sitting at my desk feeling proud, strong, and admittedly insecure when a small, skinny, flat-chested Sheena Fitzgerald walked past my door. She looked inside and apparently saw or sensed something. She stopped, turned, and walked in. Closing the door behind her, she headed toward my desk. I didn't realize it yet, but my life was about to change again. Miss Fitzgerald walked in, sat down, and began to speak. "Brad," she said, "I can see that you are troubled. I want to help." What was that? I was her boss, her principal, and she was using my name. I replied, "Miss Fitzgerald," putting the emphasis on Miss. "I'm perfectly fine. Is there anything I can help you with?" She smiled at me. Then she launched into one of the most interesting litanies I have ever heard. "Mr. Wernicke, Brad," she said, "I'm almost 32 years old. I'm not one of the prettiest girls in the world. I have a 5-year-old daughter with a loser father, but I know I can help." I thought, not a bad warm-up. After all, I was a teacher, and the old phrase, whine and moan, "you don't know how bad I feel at home," was always pretty standard for kids who wanted something. I tried to stop her, but she wouldn't let me. She was too busy throwing punches. She said, "I see, Brad, you're stuck. You're in a hole and you don't know how to get out. Believe me, I've been there." I stood up, walked out from behind the desk and headed for the door. Holding out my right hand to lead her out of the office, I said, "Listen, Miss Fitzgerald." She wasn't going to stop. I should have known because I had seen her work with her students. She was a real Energizer bunny. "Mr. Wernicke, everyone knows what happened. Everyone else is sorry, but I'm not. I figured you needed my help. I saw your kids. They're a couple of cute little kids and—" Jesus, she was pissing me off. I lowered my hand and took a step back. Without stopping, she kept coming at me. Yeah, I got it. A clear signal or a subliminal message of insecurity. Either way, I was going to regain the upper hand. Before she could get a word out, I stopped, stood up, and said, "Miss Fitzgerald, your personal—" I tried to turn off my olfactory system. Family history is irrelevant. She was wearing one of her usual, self-adjusting uniforms, a sexless business suit of thick tweed. I tried to focus my gaze on her face, but she kept averting her eyes. I sort of tried to finish the sentence, the importance to me other than— It was getting on my nerves. I may have to file a report on her, I tried to finish. How can they— Then she stepped back, uncertainty replaced by confidence. "Tomorrow," she said, finally turning and walking out of my office. Wow, I thought. Where did that come from? It took me a few seconds to regain my aplomb, but I did. What had I just experienced? It was obvious. One of three things. 1. She genuinely believed she could be a friend. 2. She was responding to some teacher's wager, some audacity. Or 3. She was a slut and saw me as just another conqueror. I came to the conclusion that it was either door number 2 or number 3. I knew what I had to do. She had to leave. I had to kick her the hell out of my school. I walked around and sat back down at my desk. Dr. DeShields, Mrs. Ariana DeShields, was my supervisor. I picked up the phone. "I'll call Ariana and arrange for Miss Fitzgerald's transfer." She was only a history teacher. There were plenty of history teachers, and she would be gone in less than a week. I called and got on Mrs. DeShields' secretary. She informed me that Dr. DeShields was out of the office. She was solving a problem at another school. Damn, I thought, guessing where she was. They were having problems at Westwood Middle School. A few days ago in a phone conversation, she mentioned that changes were coming at Westwood. On the air, she said transfers were coming. Westwood was a toilet. I knew their principal, and he was incompetent. Half the staff was incompetent. It got me thinking about the politics of the school system. It was like that in all school systems. Principals, and I was one of them, never went to the wall to fire a teacher. It was just too damn hard. Too many variables: race, gender, age, seniority, unions, politicians' relatives, coaching. We just translated them over and over. Eventually, all these lemons, it was called the lemon dance, ended up at the same school. At the time, Westwood was a lemon pit. Ariana practically offered me a position. No way. There was no way I was leaving Oakcrest, my school, for Westwood. If I had talked to Ariana about Sheena, she would have been just as willing to transfer me to Westwood. I didn't want to go there, and I certainly couldn't let them send Sheena to a place like that. The lazy wolves there would tear her to shreds. Besides, if I managed to move Miss Fitzgerald, I might end up with some loser. I thanked Dr. DeShields' secretary and told her that my call was strictly social in nature. I would call back later. I asked her not to even tell me I had called. As I hung up the phone, I breathed a sigh of relief. I had foolishly forgotten all the prime directives of school teachers and administrators. Competent people are always expected to handle their problems without crying out for help. I had to handle my problem on my own. The next day, Miss Typically Tweed Business Suits Sheena Fitzgerald came in wearing a pale green blouse of the finest soft fabric, the most seductive imaginable. The color matched the emerald of her eyes perfectly. The dark green and black miniskirt, black sandals, and black stiletto shoes elicited the expected reaction from not only me, but every single person in the school. Oh yeah, I get it. Miss Fitzgerald was a whore for hire. All women are the same. And every time I turned around, she was in or near the main office, on my home turf. It was quite obvious to me what she was up to, and I had to recognize that she was putting me at a disadvantage. Worse, at the end of the workday, as I was walking to my car to leave, she pestered me and insisted that I help her carry some boxes to her car. When I helped and finished, she stood up on her toes and touched my cheek. I immediately thought of Carol. Sheena said she hoped to meet me Friday after school. She said she would be at Denny's restaurant near our school. She said she would wait outside. I told her she was wrong to think I would be there. I told her I could lose my job. She replied that I could only lose my job if she complained, and that would never happen. She said I need someone and she thinks she can help. I told her she was crazy. She just smiled. That was on a Wednesday. Hiding in my office, I spent Thursday and Friday without any direct contact. But it wasn't because she wasn't trying. Every once in a while, I would furtively cast a glance at her. I had to admit that as thin as she was very pretty, just a tidbit, not at all like my ex-wife. Winter was coming. Friday was cold and frosty. I was sure Miss Fitzgerald wasn't stupid enough to think she could stand outside in a cold parking lot and think I was coming over. Nevertheless, just out of curiosity, I decided to drive by. There she was. She looked cold. It was ridiculous. I pulled into the parking lot, got out of the car, intending to give her a stiff lecture while I walked her to her car. I got out, walked over, and started to speak. Miss Fitzgerald. She smiled, waved, and headed toward me. Silly me. I had stupidly parked so that my car was on the opposite side of the restaurant entrance. To walk her to her car, we'd have to meet at the damn front door. She came up to me, took my hand, and started leading me to the door, laughingly saying, "I think you look like Grand Slam to me." Grand Slam was my favorite dish on the menu at Denny's. I grumbled, "I can't stay long, maybe just coffee." Snap. By then, she had squeezed my hand in the crook of her elbow. "We'll see," she said. School flings had been happening since the first school opened in Colonial, Massachusetts, but they were almost always conducted with at least a modicum of discretion. Over the years, I have caught a few such instances. I remember once going into the book room of the English department to pick up a copy of the 10th grade course book. When I walked in, I found one of our young female teachers entertaining my English department chair. They looked up, saw me, parted, quietly adjusted their outfits, and disappeared out the door. Nothing was said. I thought, is this what Sheena wanted? Some tawdry affair? Yes, it probably was. I couldn't imagine anything else. Sheena and I were sitting at a table across from each other at Denny's restaurant. I warned her, This is just for once. I only stopped because I couldn't let you stand outside in the cold. Her eyes widened and I thought, who is she kidding? She replied, no, you wouldn't have let me because you're a gentleman. And shifting in her seat, she continued, you know, I've been in love with you ever since you came to Oakcrest. My husband left me and our daughter just a few weeks before you arrived. He crushed me in the divorce. I don't mean the money, but the way he treated me, the things he said. I saw you with the kids. You were so beautiful. You were so happy. I'm sorry, but I can tell you it's been almost since the day your wife left you. I don't know the details, but I know what happened. She reached across the table and took my hand. Please, let me help. If anything, Sheena wasn't reticent. She was open and honest about her intentions. I had my doubts. Maybe she wasn't pretending to be a coward? At the same time, I felt that I had to explain to her plainly. Miss Fitzgerald, I appreciate your interest, but I must warn you that I don't see you as handsome. She swayed back and laughed. My God, I hope not. No one ever has and no one ever will. No, I just want us to be friends. We're already soulmates. I've already been through this. We can swap stories. I know I can help. At that point, I was shocked. First, I knew and saw that my comment about asexuality had hurt her. Second, I knew she was lying. Half the men and most of the boys wanted her. Third, I wondered if I needed her help. I decided I didn't, but I wanted to keep seeing her. It occurred to me that I liked her, but not as a woman, not as a potential conqueror, but as a person, just a person. I corrected my comment. I didn't mean that I didn't think you were beautiful. You are very beautiful. In any other circumstance, I would be interested, but we are colleagues. I have a school to run. Yes, I think we can be friends, but let's be professional as well. She smiled and nodded. Let's have a play date. I'll bring my girlfriend, you bring your kids, and we can talk. I noticed that she had very long eyelashes, and from the way she threw back her hair, I realized that she was wearing semicircle-shaped earrings that I guessed had tiny emeralds in them. She had small, round-pierced ears with tiny lobes. A velvety strand of reddish hair seemed to run down, covering a little of her left eye. I felt like I should raise my hand and pull them back to see her better, but I didn't. I said, okay, pick a day and time. Sheena looked at the ceiling, then at me. Not this weekend. How about next Saturday? You decide what and where. I said, no, you decide. She said, no, you're the man, you decide. I hadn't heard anything like that in years. I tried my best not to puff up my chest. Okay, next Saturday. I'll let you know where and what next week. We stood up together, shook hands, and I walked her to her car. She had a Volkswagen, a far cry from what Carol preferred. At her car, we shook hands again. I helped her into the seat and stepped aside as she started the car and drove off. I watched her as she drove out of the parking lot. As soon as she pulled away, I started to have doubts. I checked my watch. I had to hurry so I could get home before the kids arrived. Later that night, after putting the kids to bed, I foolishly pulled out some old photos of Carol and me. When she left, she didn't take any pictures of me, just a few of our kids, and she left our wedding album to me. I don't know why I did it, but I went through the old photos. It was so sad. I don't know why, but I was crying. I knew I would have to end my relationship with Miss Fitzgerald before anything would change. The following Monday, I was on hallway duty when Miss Fitzgerald came in from the station to pick up the morning mail and student list. I think the look on my face gave me away. She saw me and turned pale. Her bright, cheerful face turned ashy gray. I chickened out. I covered my face with a smile and headed straight for her. Good morning, the teachers and students said. I didn't try to show discretion. Loudly and deliberately, I proclaimed, there's a skating rink a few blocks from my house. We could take the kids ice skating and then have lunch at my place. Teachers, students, and staff walked by. They heard every word, but pretended not to hear. I knew that by the end of the day, everyone in the building would know that Miss Fitzgerald and I were keeping company. Miss Fitzgerald looked uncertain. I was sure my first face had alerted her and now she just didn't know. She replied, I never learned to skate, and my child... I very gently reached out and touched her hand. Wonderful. I can be your teacher. She finally truly smiled, but I could still tell she wasn't quite sure, and she replied, okay, let's do it. Coincidentally, it was the first week of the month, Most principals use the first Monday for faculty meetings. I preferred the first Tuesday. Mondays were bad enough as it was. The next day, that Tuesday, when we met in the cafeteria, I sort of discreetly nodded to the table closest to me when Sheena walked in. She took the hint and sat up front. I was determined not to hide anything. People would gossip anyway. I wanted everyone to know that this was about friendship and not some sordid affair. The faculty meeting followed the usual pattern. They all sucked. After the department chairs and athletic director gave their usual speeches, I asked for questions or comments. This was my shit time. I got the usual questions. Why aren't we enforcing this or that rule? Shouldn't someone be in the cafeteria making the kids clean up after themselves with trash? Why aren't you banning kids from eating in the hallways? And the always audible, I won't attend meetings where prayer is recited. I listened to all of these complaints, reminded everyone to listen to the morning announcements of school closings or delayed school openings at WKRP, and then reminded them one last time that we are all in the building to teach, and that we all need to remember that. I wanted to end with a prayer, but knew that any such move would result in a call from Dr. D. Shields. I thought about my school. I thought about some of my teachers. I thought about Miss Fitzgerald. I thought about prayer at school. There were a few teachers I didn't like. There was a small group of teachers who I privately referred to as headhunters. These were teachers who seemed to devote their lives to catching kids who broke the rules. The district had a system-wide rule about leather coats. Kids were not supposed to wear leather coats to school. This was for a few schools where theft was common. We had no such problems, but there were a couple of teachers who seemed to enjoy catching and punishing kids for their outfits. One of them was a particularly mean older woman. She couldn't teach worth a damn, but she sure knew the rules of behavior for her students. One day, one little girl got a suede coat for Christmas. Old Mrs. Nasty caught her and dragged her down the stairs to the main hallway where I usually was. Old Mrs. Nasty pointed to the girl's coat and said, "Leather coat, what are you going to do with it?" Of course it was nonsense. She was just trying to embarrass me in a crowded hall. The girl almost cried when she said, "Mr. Wernicke, my coat is suede, not leather." I smiled affectionately at the child, took the coat and said, "It's okay, sweetie." I frowned, looking at old Mrs. Nasty and growled, "You heard her, suede coat." Old Mrs. Nasty was furious. She stomped her foot angrily. The half-dozen children watching the scene laughed softly. I took the girl to the main office where I calmly explained what suede was. Later that afternoon, I received a printout from old Mrs. Nasty in which the definition of suede was highlighted in yellow marker. Then there were the fastening nuts. We had several elderly ladies who insisted that every hall meeting begin with a prayer. I never had a problem with that. They always mentioned Jesus, but none of my other faith teachers ever complained. Of course, there was assembly duty. Several teachers always had to be on standby to keep an eye on the kids. I had two nasty younger teachers who were wild pains in the ass. They threatened that if there was ever again an assembly starting with prayer, they would refuse to be on assembly duty. I begrudgingly agreed and they were relieved of duty. I reassigned them to cafeteria duty, the worst non-teaching job in any school. I chuckled softly to myself at the thought of them standing in the middle of the cafeteria with kids throwing food particles at them for 25 minutes. Why was I thinking about those hateful teachers? I thought about them because I knew that most of them had a special hatred for Miss Fitzgerald. Poor Sheena was constantly being called on the carpet by one assistant principal or another. Sheena tried to do something about it. She would hold mock trials in the classroom. She planned and took the kids on field trips. She, God forbid, even allowed kids to go to the bathroom during class. In other words, little Sheena Fitzgerald, being a creative, innovative teacher, was hated by the "that's not my job" crowd. Okay, I was weak, but I guess I liked Miss Fitzgerald. If I was careful, if I kept a low profile, no one could complain, and I could make a friend. The idea seemed perfectly acceptable. Oh no, I was wrong. After that, it all went downhill from there. We went ice skating. I hadn't skated since the divorce. Bridget went ice skating but never learned. Brad Jr., however, skated pretty well. We went ice skating. Bridget fell. Sheena fell. Sheena's girl, Laura, fell. I even fell. It was fun. After riding, we went back to the condo, made homemade pizza, and watched a video. We watched an old Disney thing called Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Even Brad Jr. liked it. Like I said, things went downhill from there. My kids fell in love with it. I still had serious trust issues, but Sheena proved she was the real deal. We started dating in earnest. After our first real date, she insisted that all subsequent dates be attended by my kids and her Laura. This Sheena was great. Sheena gave all of herself. She didn't hold anything back. She told my kids right away that she didn't want to be their mother, but wanted to be my friend and help where she could. I was ready. I never believed it could happen again. I kept waiting for another shoe to drop, for something bad to happen. It was crazy. Nothing bad was happening. My life was getting better and better. I sat down and looked at the notes I had made for my son. I knew there were more things I needed to add. Who was Sheena? What had happened to her? What bad things had she told me? What role did she play, and how did she become such an important part of everything we did? Some things young Brad knew, but I felt he still needed to hear what he didn't know. I remembered how I had suffered after the divorce. I was lonely, embittered, despairing, and had a deep sense of inadequacy. I especially remembered the loneliness, how it gnawed at me. It's the kind of thing that can eat a person from the inside out. I felt like I didn't meet all the requirements. I wasn't good enough. I remember constantly wondering where I had failed. Had I failed in my role as breadwinner, father, lover? I just didn't know. Carol never told me. I remember desperately needing answers a denouement, but it never came. Somehow Sheena sensed it. She seemed to know. We talked. It wasn't easy. She was a woman, and I had developed a healthy distrust of the opposite sex. Deciding to honor her request for a date, I went back to my high school records and checked her background. I learned very little. She, like me, had graduated from a fairly ordinary state college. She was a little younger than me and had a young daughter. Nothing was mentioned about her husband, so I first assumed she had a child out of wedlock, and what she said about the divorce was a lie. A difficult divorce can take such a toll on a person. I noticed that she had changed her name. Admittedly, I was paranoid. I had her address, so I drove by her apartment complex and watched. I wanted to see if she was seeing someone else. Maybe she's just reaching out to me. Maybe she's sneaking into some joint after work. It was hard for me to take a chance and try to trust another person. It was so hard. Our first dates were homemade, the simplest. We'd go to Denny's or Texas Roadhouse and usually a movie. Was I a cheapskate? Yes, but I didn't know this woman. I just knew I had to be careful and find out as much as I could. Was I surprised? I learned so much that I felt like I was reading a book. I guess I was. And the subject matter was already familiar to me. Sheena told me her story, and in the process of telling it, it set me free. Her story played out one night when our kids were asleep in their rooms, Brad Jr. in his, and Laura with Bridget. Sheena and I spent another wonderfully restless time tossing and turning in my bed. Back to Sheena's story. Like me, she fell in love with her high school sweetheart, but like me, they avoided using birth control. In middle school, Sheena discovered she was having a baby. Her boyfriend wanted an abortion, but Sheena wouldn't give up. They got married and both managed to work and finish college. Sheena's uncle was a judge. He made some calls and she ended up in Oakcrest. Her husband became a car salesman. He sold Saabs. I heard rumors. I doubted they were true, but I heard that only vain jerks bought Saabs. I only bought Fords or Chevrolets, so it didn't matter. She said he was a good salesman but a bad husband and lover. According to her, she never fully understood what slam bam thank you ma'am meant until she got married. He never hurt her, but according to her, he wasn't very affectionate. He tried to chase her and get her to come back, but she returned home to her parents. Her husband tried to take their little girl, but her father got a restraining order, and when her uncle found her a good lawyer, her husband finally backed off. The divorce went through and she was left practically alone, with only Laura. Of course, her mom and dad wouldn't let that happen. Laura was very young at the time, and Sheena's mom came to her rescue. As I listened to Sheena, I realized that as bad as my divorce was, her divorce was even worse. Carol or her doctor never threatened me or feared physical harm. No one ever twisted my arms. I realized that I had fallen in love with Sheena, and it scared me. I was afraid to make a new commitment. She saw right through me. She told me some of the things her husband had told her. At the end, She said he had gone from angry to discouraged. He told her that he was already seeing someone else, someone better in bed, someone who appreciated him, and that this new and better someone had money. Then he would get sad and guilty. He would cry and whine that she was too good for him, that he needed someone not so honorable and not afraid to get dirty. Finally, she said, her husband confessed everything. He'd had affairs, been with several other women. He told her he did it because it was exciting. It was always an adventure, and he knew he could get away with it. He said she was boring, and he just couldn't imagine himself living with her for the rest of his life. I listened and realized that Sheena's husband was saying a lot of what Carol was saying or trying to say to me. I thought, it's probably part of the usual lamentations infidels use to justify their atrocities. Yes, Carol and Sheena's husband were evil, brutally evil people. But they were both right about one thing. Neither of them was good enough for the one they betrayed. As I listened to Sheena's story, I realized why Carol had to divorce me. It wasn't about the job or the money or the power or prestige, but because Carol always knew I was better. I was better than Carol. She was the one who was inferior. She was the one who failed, not me. I got Sheena to agree to give up her apartment and move her and her daughter in with me. A few weeks later, Sheena and I sat our kids down at the table and had the big talk. They were miles above us. Shortly thereafter, Sheena and I bonded in marriage. In attendance were her parents, my siblings and their children, and a few of our teacher friends. I loved her, truly loved her. I had finally found happiness again. I had found fulfillment. I believed that she did too. Of course, my feelings for Carol had changed. I no longer hated her. I felt sorry for her. It seemed that while my life was getting better, Carol had already had one child with Dr. Gilmore, but she had broken up with him. It seems she found someone even better. She sued Gilmore to get a divorce and start openly dating a heart surgeon. I didn't know what to think. We dated for almost 6 years and were married for 12 before she accepted my proposal. With Gilmore, she'd been with him for a little over 3. I was sure there was more to the story. I thought Carol was sick. Carol was divorced? Did she see a heart surgeon? Yes, she did. And from what I hear, she's supposedly happily married. But you never know with Carol. I do know one thing. I once thought I had gotten everything I wanted, but I saw it turn to dust. Now I realize I was given a second chance and I took full advantage of it. Epilogue. Carol's story is long over for me, but whenever Brad Jr. stopped by our house, he always had something to say about his mom. He was worried about her. He said that every time he stopped by her house, all she talked about was me, her, and our long-dead marriage. He said she seemed to think too much about the past. One day she said she was a little sorry she divorced me. I was sorry too, at the time. I even feel sorry for Carol now. I think she's looking for something she'll never find. She came to Brad Jr. Aunt's wedding, but she didn't bring anyone. I thought she had a heart surgeon she could bring. She looked as beautiful as ever. I danced with her once at the reception and she still felt good in my arms. I still remembered her perfume. We talked and laughed about old things. About halfway through the dance, I noticed Carol hugging herself. I was a little embarrassed and felt awkward. I looked over at Sheena. She was smiling. She noticed it too. I thought, that's my girl. I was a little surprised. Carol had mentioned Vernon Smithers. I'm not sure, but I think I heard that this guy had his own machine shop. I thought that maybe Carol's mom and dad shouldn't have separated them. I thought that maybe Carol had found what she was looking for at 16, but she had been robbed of it. It was sad in a way. Back to the real world. Shortly after Sheena and I got married, we had to buy something bigger than an apartment. Now there are 8 of us, counting Junior and his wife. And of course, Bridget and Laura. Sheena and I have since added 2 more. Sean, who is now 10, and Eileen, who is only 7. Sheena has quit teaching. Lately she's lost a little weight, looks softer, even prettier, if that's possible. She says she likes staying home, says she enjoys cooking and taking care of the kids. She still visits Oakcrest often. She teaches banjo playing and tutors SATs part-time. I'm not against all of that. I will say this, Sheena can have or do whatever she wants, and that is a fact. I see that Brad Jr. just pulled up to the house. He's only been married a couple years. I hope I'm ready for what he wants to hear. I hope things work out with his wife. She's a good girl. If not, we'll be there for him. That's what parents do. One last thing. Am I happy? That's a stupid question. The end. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, so subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.